Hey, good day, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. Today's webinar is Why is Compliance Worth It? It's sponsored by IndePractice, which is a platform from the Medical Association of Georgia, and also our company, VenOps, a compliance company, and Karosh Compliance, another compliance company. The agenda broadly is about why is compliance important? What are the risks? The potential penalties? We'll address some of the best practices, and then conclude and take any questions that might be in the chat. The guests today are the CEO and founder of Karosh Compliance, Roger Schindel. He's been the founder since 2010. He's a graduate of Washington State University and the University of Idaho. He's a certified healthcare privacy and security expert from the American Healthcare Information Management Association. Roger's a noted speaker and author, and we are very honored to have him as our guest today. Our other speaker will speak on a different subject. Roger's focus is HIPAA compliance. Our other speaker focuses on OIG exclusion screening, and that is Stephen Maloney. Stephen is the Chief Operating Officer of VenOps since 2017. He is certified in healthcare compliance by the Compliance Certification Board. He's a graduate of the Citadel, former U.S. Air Force nuclear security officer, and a veteran of the medical industry since 2007. We are honored to have Stephen as our guest. So the purpose of today's interview is really to explore the why. Why is compliance worth it? We're going to ask both our guests to share their views on why compliance is crucial for medical practices and especially independent medical practices. So we'll start with HIPAA. Roger, can you briefly explain what HIPAA compliance for medical practice is all about and why it's important?
Sure. So HIPAA gets a bad rap. Many times we hear that HIPAA gets in the way of providing care. Nothing to be further from the truth. The problem is that HIPAA is really you don't know what you don't know. One of the things people are concerned about is fines and penalties around HIPAA breaches. While they can be significant, they're not what clients really need to worry about. So covered entities need to understand that if they have a HIPAA breach or if their patients don't believe that they're adequately protecting their PHI, their protected health information, their personal information, 2/3 of them say they'll actually leave the practice. And additionally, if you do have a breach, while right now, for example, the median size penalty for a breach is $65,000, you're going to have an additional $330,000 in lost revenue from reputational harm. People that leave the practice, people that never seen your practice, basically you don't get the referrals. And as you're well aware, your practice relies on referrals to maintain your revenue and grow your revenue. So you need to look at both sides. You need to be concerned about fines and penalties, but more importantly, you need to be concerned about the reputational harm that comes from having a breach.
Very good. Stephen, can you briefly explain what OIG exclusion screening is and why compliance with the Health and Human Services OIG exclusion screening mandate is important for medical practices?
Absolutely. OIG screening is a basic part of any compliance program. It's actually one of the 7 basic tenets of any compliance program. It involves pre-hire screening and re-screening on a regular basis against all of the various state and federal agency sources for Medicare, Medicaid, TRICARE, et cetera, sanction lists. As far as what else you want to consider with that, we could follow on question with that, but that's the gist of it.
Thank you. Thank you. And you said it's mandatory?
Indeed it is. It is a mandatory item. Most importantly with that is primarily a mitigating factor when it comes to all sorts of compliance program items. But to begin with, as I mentioned, pre-hire screening and then re-screening on a monthly basis typically. However, in our service, we do tend to see daily screening. It depends on the level of compliance program in practice.
I see. Good. So what are the risks if you're not compliant as it relates to HIPAA, Roger?
Well, there are a variety of risks. People typically think about OCR, Office for Civil Rights, who oversees HIPAA. And the risks are fines, penalties, as I said, the loss of patients and loss of revenue. But on top of HIPAA, in today's world, you also need to worry about the Federal Trade Commission, because they manage or are responsible for regulating any protected health information that may be on the web. So if you're using a web portal, a website, even to the extent of doing appointments and appointment reminders, you're going to fall under the regulatory authority of the FTC. Additionally, FTC also looks at things like truth in advertising. And, so for example, if you have things on your website that aren't technically true, the FTC will also come down on that. And you also need to worry about OIG, just like you need with the exclusion screening, in that you can trigger False Claims Act. So if you're making claims that are not true on your website and actually within your practice, you can trigger False Claims Act, which has, fines and penalties that are much higher than under the HIPAA regulations, and also bleed over into criminal acts as opposed to just civil acts.
Great. Thanks. Thanks a lot. So, Stephen, what are the risks associated with noncompliance as it relates to OIG exclusion screening? And our follow-up question, by the way, for this will be about what are the potential penalties. So, Stephen, if you want to say what the risks are and segue into the penalties, Roger, I'll come back to you about penalties for HIPAA.
Sure. I like to classify the potential risks into three categories. First one is the financial aspect of it, both from the aspect of the civil monetary penalties that can activate, but also then the legal penalties as well. Retainment of legal counsel in response to any scenario where an excluded party is identified. The second one is going to be reputational damage. These cases are published by the OIG. It highlights the level of maybe the compliance failure in place, and then that's publicly available, as I said. So folks would see that. That may have a result with decreased patient volume and so on. And the third would be the operational disruptions. Anytime the OIG is going to walk in that door, you're going to see a disruption. That, of course, with all the internal investigations then in place as well, that might also follow on. And as a follow-on there with the possible penalties, there is associated with every found excluded party or affiliation, either hired or affiliated, I should say. There is always a base civil monetary penalty adjusted for inflation every year around the September timeframe. Right now, it resides at over $24,000 for just the base CMP. And there is also additional, there are additional CMPs, additional penalties included, including repayment of all associated federal healthcare fund associated payments that occurred during the association of that particular individual or vendor or entity. So they can become exponential quite quick.
So it doesn't have to be an individual excluded. It could be a company or vendor per se.
That's right. It can be a company. Well, the focus tends to be on the provider aspect of screening. However, all staff should be screened. All associated vendors, contracted providers, pharmacies, vendors in play that are associated in the provision of healthcare or should be screened. Yes.
Okay. And so, Roger, what kind of risks are we talking about, or I should say potential penalties that are associated with HIPAA transgressions, and how big can they get?
Sure. So you have to look at it from two different sides. You have to look at it from the federal, and then also every state has their own set of HIPAA regulations. On the federal side of the coin, as I said earlier, the average fine right now is $65,000. There is something in regulation where fines can be as low as $300, but that's for inadvertently violating HIPAA and not knowing about it. Those days have come and gone. So typically the lowest penalties we see are in the $24,000 range. At the federal level, they can go up to 1.2 million for each incident, the same incident in a year. So that's the ceiling at the federal level. At the state level, there is no ceiling. So we've seen penalties assessed in the multi-million-dollar range. So people who have a penalty at the federal level are also going to see one at the state level. And then if you bleed over into the False Claims Act and OIG gets involved, those penalties and fines can be astronomical. For example, in 2023, the median fine from OIG for these sorts of violations were $150,000, 3 times what it is under the straight HIPAA regulation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that sounds pretty severe. If going a little bit off script, if our practice had a cyber breach and the privacy of patients were, thus, exploited, what kind of penalties are we talking about there? Are these going to go under HIPAA or some other regulatory action? Roger?
Yeah, so this is kind of an interesting wrinkle in the 21st Century Cures Act. There's a section which was trying to address having robust cybersecurity in place. And so if you do have robust cybersecurity in place and you can demonstrate it, there actually is the regulatory agencies can mediate or mitigate fines and penalties that are set. So regulations are all designed to make a best effort at keeping from occurring, but understanding you can't keep them all from occurring. They're looking for a best effort. So again, if you have robust cybersecurity in place, while it still fall under the HIPAA and also under the FTC for anything that's online, you can mitigate the risk by having robust cybersecurity in place for those fines and penalties.
That's a recurring theme that I hear as it relates to HIPAA and as it relates to OIG exclusion screening and other types of compliance is if you have a robust program and you've done your very best, the mitigation factor is actually quite high. So that's really good. That's a good segue into the next question, Roger, and that is, what are some of the best practices for ensuring compliance with HIPAA within a medical practice?
Sure. So kind of leveraging off of what we were just discussing, one of the things you can do is, if part of your privacy program is to encrypt all your information. If you have a breach, there's actually a safe harbor exemption from the breach because the data is encrypted. And that's both in transit, which is easy to do, and at rest, which unfortunately most people don't do. Unfortunately, about 80% of practices don't comply with HIPAA regulations, and we talk about the 7 deadly sins around HIPAA. The first one is not doing training correctly. OCR and actually Homeland Security have indicated their belief is virtually every breach's root cause is inadequate training because you need to train on your own policies and procedures. Second is you need to do a risk assessment there's 103 vulnerabilities outlined in the regulations, and you need to assign a probability that each vulnerability come to pass as part of your risk assessment. Then you need to have a remediation plan, which is a roadmap to remediate all these vulnerabilities. You need to vet your business associates for their compliance under the regulations, because if they breach your data, you'll be held responsible. And actually, since 2012, if you find the business associate is not complying with HIPAA, then you need to terminate your relationship with them. Talk about training. And the last one is there's a segment under the regulation that says you need to address any anticipatable threats. And that's where things like cybersecurity come in. So you need to look at the environment you're operating in and make sure that you're addressing any anticipatable threats with the same items I just talked about: training, risk assessment, remediation plan, making sure your business associates are up to snuff and that you're looking at all the items. So best practice is to essentially cover all those. And fortunately, unfortunately, there's very little difference between what you need to do irrespective of the size of the practice.
Great. And what are some of the best practices, Stephen, for ensuring compliance with OIG exclusion screening? I mean, I guess this kind of gets into how do you, if you're a medical practice, how do you do it?
Well, the guidance by HHS OIG prior to this year was pretty good, but still left a lot open to interpretation. As of November of this past year, they did publish a very good bit of instruction that more fully outlined best practices, which has been great. As far as a good, robust screening program, it's just going to be part of any culture of compliance instilled by the compliance officer in any organization. It's going to start, as I mentioned originally, with pre-hire screening. These don't ever get covered in your historical or traditional background screening. This is more of a specialized screening item, given the nature of the various agencies involved. Pre-hire screening is important to make sure that no one is hired right off the get-go. Regular monthly screening at a minimum. What a good idea is always to consider is a third party to get this done for you. If you take into account the Medicare-based exclusion and sanction lists that exist that you want to include, from the federal to the state level, it's about 70 lists. And the time requirement and the resources necessary to properly stay on top of those with their monthly intermittent updates is a little more excessive than any particular program can absorb. So a third party is a good idea to consider. When you just take into account the basic items I've mentioned, you're going to be in pretty good shape to follow best practices as recently put out by the OIG with their November publication.
Okay, very good. Hey, I'm curious about whether technology, AI, these things are all in the news, Chat GPT. How can technology come into play in maintaining compliance with HIPAA and OIG exclusion screening? And Roger, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so these technologies are causing some issues that need to be addressed. They can be addressed. So, for example, Chat GPT, for example, is storing your information out in the cloud. It actually uses whatever you put into Chat GPT to train itself to provide better answers. So there is a potential to disclose PHI, protected health information, what you put in Chat GPT. Additionally, AI is being used for things like note-taking in clinical settings, and again, that can be exposing PHI. out to the general public as the AI engines are training themselves. And one of the issues we've seen most recently are tracking pixels, little pieces of code that organizations like Google and Microsoft and Meta put out onto a website for marketing purposes that can be collecting information that they shouldn't be collecting, and then reusing that information for marketing purposes by third parties. So you need to lock down those systems. And if you are going to use things like tracking pixels or AI, you need to include in your notice of privacy practices that in fact these technologies are being used and the kinds of security they're putting in place around them. So we're in a whole new world regarding technology for things like AI and ChatGPT, and you just need to, and again, these would fall under the rubric of being anticipatable vulnerabilities. So you need to have specific policies, procedures, safeguards, and disclosures to protect around them.
Very good, thanks. So Stephen, how can technology help as far as OIG exclusion screening is concerned? And do you use it?
We do use it. First of all, it's a shame I don't have 20 minutes to talk about this, but real briefly, AI in exclusion screening. First of all, right, no PII in ChatGPT. It does tend to store everything, and yeah. Our service does leverage AI at the moment, only insofar as considering the accuracy of the master database that is accumulated on a monthly, daily, weekly basis. You want to use maybe some AI as a scrubber to make sure that every name on a particular agency list is included for sure in the master database. It's really more about efficiency in the master database creation and maintenance. There will always, I think, for the time being, be humans in the loop as far as investigating and clearing potential sanctions and exclusions that are found. That takes a little more nuance at times. It does utilize objective data, but it needs to be maintained in a completely secure environment. And that's relatively critical aspect of the process. Where does AI fit in down the road? That's going to be up to the interpretation of the service, I think. It just, as I said initially, we've gotten into using it as far as maintenance and accuracy and efficiency for the master database.
Very good. So I'm going to combine a couple of questions here as we get closer to the wrap up here. So I'm curious, how important in a medical practice program is training and education as far as compliance is concerned? And what are the most important changes you see coming in the landscape of compliance in the next 5 years? So Roger, I'll let you take a swing first.
Sure. So when it comes to training, as I pointed out earlier, both OCR, Office of Civil Rights, and Homeland Security believe that the root cause of virtually every breach is inadequate training. And that's because people don't typically train on their own policies and procedures. They also kind of do a check the box. So once a year, they'll hire someone to do some generalized training, which is good, but it doesn't build a culture of compliance that you're looking for. So in our practice, we do quarterly trainings that are 10 to 15 minutes in length. So you're still getting about that hour's worth of training, but we're training on the specific policies and procedures. And by training more frequently, you're building that culture of compliance, and the retention percentages go way up. In terms of what's going to happen in the next 5 years, more regulations are coming down the pike. They're going to bleed out of HIPAA into things like protected personal information, something analogous to the GDPR, General Data Protection Requirements, that are part of the EU. 3 states have already adopted, or essentially cloned versions of that. 23 states have adopted somewhat more than that. So not only are you going to need to worry, and actually at this point need to worry, not only about PHI, but also PPI. So more generalized, identifiable information that can lead to identity theft. Add that or multiply that by the changes that are occurring in technology, and to essentially echo what Stephen said, it becomes enormously difficult for a practice to be able to do this on their own. They should strongly consider having a third party work with them to make sure that they're up to date on all the compliance requirements.
Very good. Great answers. So, Stephen, how important is training and education for OIG exclusion screening, and do you see the landscape for that changing much in the next few years?
Mm-hmm. The industry has done a great job of training and education for the very existence and the requirement of exclusion and sanction screening for the last decade. I think that as little as 5, 6, 7, 10 years ago, 90% of organizations in healthcare didn't really understand that it was a requirement. It stayed as low-hanging fruit for OIG for the longest time, and now more often than not today, people know that it exists out there. The question still remains is how to do it efficiently. On the federal side, those lists are certainly screened more often than not at a base level, maybe just once. In the next 5 years, I think that you're going to see the continued transition to more awareness and following along with that compliance program guidance. I think that just as an example, when you consider the amount of time it took for the federal screening to really take hold, which is now more solidly rooted, the Affordable Care Act made it a requirement that if anyone is excluded, any staff or entities are excluded on the state lists, they apply to exclusion across all states. That so far today is not enforced. So you could throw that back in that old category of low-hanging fruit, perhaps, that might come out during an investigation. That I think is going to be in the next 5 years. You're going to start seeing that more and more occurring just as a general compliance requirement. So the state list screening is going to become far more across the board critical.
Right. So in my final question, something I'm hearing over and over again is that a solid compliance program is essential for medical practice, obviously. And how does one who listens to this webinar get from you risk assessment, or how do they query you? How do they reach you? And Roger, I'll let you start. Do you do risk assessments? Is that a first step? And how would they reach you? And Stephen, I'll go to you next.
Yeah, so we provide the full boat of requirements under the regulations. We actually guarantee our work. So someone that goes through our program, we actually indemnify them for the first 100,000 in breaches and fines and penalties resulting from breaches. The risk assessment is the first step, followed by a remediation plan, and followed by the remediation. Way to contact us is you can email me at rmshindell, SHINDELL, at Carosh, CAROSH.com, or go to our website, Carosh, CAROSH.com, and you'll see our services, see a lot of good information about what you need to do, and you can actually schedule a time for us to meet and discuss your specific needs.
Great, thanks, Roger. Stephen, how does someone reach you, and will you do a risk assessment or an overview of a medical practice at their request?
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely. I will always listen to the current compliance program set in place and go over and offer some guidance according to best practices, of course. If anyone ever wants to reach me, smaloney@venops.com, SMALONEY at VENOPS.com is a fantastic way to reach me. We will always provide training on demand. Getting started with VenOps in particular, or any third party, any good third party program is always going to offer some great training to get started. Onboarding process can vary in length from very straightforward to more in depth. It doesn't need to be, LexisNexis level of complex, but if you get started, it's really relatively quick process. Get started in a matter of minutes. It's really more important to learn the requirements for name formatting. How accurate is the the screening for potential matches, and they all pretty much going to screen the same lists. But how many different avenues of screening are available? That'll all be covered in the training. Single name screening, bulk screening, how often can they be done? Is it automated as far as rescreening? All of these things are taken into consideration. So anyone is welcome to always reach out to me.
Thank you. Thank you both very much for being our guests today. We're exactly on time at the ending, so that we couldn't have planned it better. I wish everyone a good day. This recording will be available for anybody that wants it, and just reach out to either one of you two for the recording. Have a good day.
Thank you for having us.